My name is Debbie Biondolillo. I do human resources consulting. Have spent first half of my career inside of organizations running human resources functions. I was at Intel, I was at Apple for 10 years, then I did a startup called Go. When we sold it, which means you made no money on it whatsoever, but when we sold Go, I started doing consulting at that point in time. So I've been doing consulting in the venture world primarily. All of my stuff comes through referrals, so I've got clients that run the spectrum. But most of what I do is in the venture space. What I love doing is working with early to mid-stage companies in the whole development phase. And what I do is primarily organizational development, but it spans. It depends on what the company needs. So I work with companies at the very early stage of, okay, how do we build out our executive team, to companies as they start getting a little bit bigger and we need to then deal with the functional areas and how you integrate those, do a lot of executive coaching and a lot of executive feedback. So that's kind of what I wind up doing. What I was asked to talk about today is performance management, but more performance management inside of your organization. How do you build an environment that feedback is something that's a normal part of your process? How do you use that to improve the performance of your organization? So that's what I want to focus on today. I want to keep it to the point where I'm going to leave a lot of time at the end for questions, because there may be specific things that you need and you want, and I want to make sure we have time to do that. But also during the presentation, if there's a question you have or something you want clarification, stop me, because I don't want this to be a real big formal thing. Okay? Make sense? Okay. What I want to do is get a little bit of context first from you. This is the participation part of the afternoon. So when you think about for yourself, have you had a situation where somebody gave you feedback? It could be inside the organization, could be outside the organization, could be from anywhere, that really had an impact on you and had an impact on the way in which you do the work that you do? Any of you had that? That you don't have to share what the feedback was, you just have to share that you got it. Yeah. So what was it about the way that feedback came to you that made an impact? What was it?
So it didn't come to me directly.
Which happens a lot.
So okay. That actually made a bigger impact on me because...
Why so?
Because I had no idea, okay. And then I addressed it, and then that was awkward. It was like, I heard you told this person that you said X, and like, how can I improve on X? Okay.
So it got your attention, even if it wasn't direct. Yep. What about somebody over here said that they had? Yeah.
I like direct feedback and communication generally. So like there have been times when potentially your supervisor, whoever, say something directly, kind of help me remember it was.
Yeah.
Helps us sit.
Yep. What about yours?
I mean, for me, it came from like my boss I really respected. So just having that, I really liked him, I valued his opinion, and because I felt like I had that, it's easier for me to sort of take what he's saying to heart.
Yeah. So it was a direct, it was from somebody that you trust. What about some of the other options?
Mine in particular was from somebody who I don't interact with very frequently, but is very high level. Mm-hmm. And the feedback that was there, I rarely interact in person. So just kind of the unique circumstances of it made it very memorable and impactful.
In a good way or in a
bad way? In a good way. In a good way.
Yeah, so it's interesting, you know, and I hear this a lot when people say, you know, the thing that's one, the fact the person took the time to do it, the two, that it was direct and it was something that I could deal with. But what's fascinating when I go in and talk to employees, the frustration that they have in organizations is nobody tells me. So, you know, so that's why I want to focus on what are some ways and some skills that you can have that you can improve the ability of your organization to give the feedback. So now I want to talk about your organization and get some sense from you. If you had to say, this is kind of the feedback. Okay, let me do. How many of you have less than 50 employees? Okay, everybody's else got, okay. So, because again, it changes as you get larger, as those of you who have been in organizations as they've grown. But if you describe the culture, the feedback culture of your organization today, what would be some of the words that you would use to describe? Open? Oh, by the way, I cannot spell. So if you see me write something up here and it's like, what in the hell did she just write? Let me know. But usually it looks kind of like the word. So spell checker was made for me. Okay, open. What else? What else describes your current culture?
Unbalanced, meaning that like there's plenty of happy, good feedback, but if there's anything that needs improvement, it's rare to hear that.
Okay, so it's more on the plus side. Yep. So it comes from above, below, beside. Yep. Okay. Doesn't happen very often or on a regular kind of basis. Yep. You gotta wave. Yeah. Direct. Mm-hmm. In other words,
Inconsistent, like different people view it very differently.
mm-hmm. So you get different points of view. You may be getting feedback that contradicts each other. Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Oops. Okay. So if you rated your organization 1 to 5, 5 meaning it's really very, very effective in the way we give feedback. We give it a lot. It works for us, whatever that happens to be. How many of you would say 1 to 5, you're a 4 or 5 as an organization? Okay, how about a 2 or 3? Okay, anybody in the ones? Okay, yeah, it's honest. It's honest feedback. So it's interesting because one of the things that I think that we know is when you get feedback, if it's done in the right kind of way, it can be very helpful. But yet in organizations, we don't spend a lot of time to build an environment where that happens on a regular basis. And by the way, you're going to hear this throughout there. I'm not a huge fan of performance reviews. Okay? I think there's a place for them. I think there's a need for them. But that's different. So I'm not going to talk a lot about performance reviews. I'm going to talk about feedback. Because to me, that's the piece that's critical. Performance reviews happen to be one vehicle to get that feedback. Okay? So you're going to see me go from there. So let's talk a little bit about then what feedback is and the way I define feedback. I believe that feedback is it's a mirror. It's a reflection of other people's perception of our behaviors. So it's not necessarily our intent, it's how they're receiving it. And it's important to recognize that because sometimes when you get feedback, you're talking about inconsistent feedback, sometimes when you get feedback, it's like, wait a minute, no, that's not what I was doing. Well, that may have been how it was perceived, and so you need to recognize that. So feedback is that reflection piece, and it matters because it's a way for you to get information about how you are being perceived and how you are, people are interacting with you within the environment. So when you think about that, it's not about judging, it's not only critique, it's this whole thing of let me tell you what I'm perceiving and whether it works or it doesn't work for me. And when you get that feedback, then it gives you the ability to say, I'm either going to change their perception because they got the wrong intent of what I was trying to do, or I'm going to change the behaviors to be more effective. Does that definition make sense to you? Okay. By the way, this means yes. That means no. Blank stares. I'll go from there. So my belief is that the role of the manager in the organization, and you are all in some type of leadership position within your organization, the role of the manager is to create an environment where you manage performance. Right? That's why you're in a management role, one of the reasons you're in a management role. And that consists of, number one, setting expectations. And we're not going to talk as much about that today, but that's where it starts. What are the expectations you have for an individual on what they're going to do and also how they're going to do it? Okay? It's not enough just to set the goal that says increase revenue by 25%. There's some how stuff that goes with that, how you want them to accomplish that goal. So expectations are what and how. The piece where performance management comes in and where feedback plays a part is on the on-the-job coaching. So as they are out doing what they need to be doing, how are they doing? So are they doing well and you want to reinforce that, which is one of the purposes of feedback? Or do they need course correction? So they need to go in a slightly different way. And then feedback comes in again when you're in the process of reviewing or rewarding performance. So whether you have performance reviews or not, whether you're doing merit-based pay or not, that's where the feedback comes in as well. And hopefully, the feedback that's given in the on-the-job coaching and the feedback that's given in the review and reward are consistent. Right? Where you get into trouble sometimes is when they're not. So again, this is what we're going to focus on today, and what I'm going to talk about feedback in context of this model. Okay? Now, I've had people actually say to me, and some of my clients, they'll go in and they'll say, well, you know, I don't feel right about giving these people feedback. What right do I have to give them feedback? And this is coming, and honest to God comments, coming from managers, and I'm saying, it's not a right, it's a responsibility. And I think sometimes we assume that we put people in management roles and we make the assumption that they know part of their job is giving feedback. I will tell you, do not make that assumption. Not everybody believes that that's what they should be doing. So if you're holding your managers accountable for providing feedback and direction, you need to let them know that you're holding them accountable for that. Have any of you run into a similar kind of comment in your organizations? Nope. It just must be the ones that I work with. So, yeah. So you did. Thank you. Well, you know, and again, I think it's one. It's one of the things about management. Management is not, the role of a manager is not intuitively obvious. And we go to school to learn some things, and then, you know, you get some of the management classes when you go to school, and then you're dropped into an organization, and sometimes you come in and you don't have anybody working for you, and then all of a sudden you start getting people underneath working for you in your team. And particularly in startup environments, you get people that have never had that management experience. And so the more explicit you can be about what you expect from those managers, the more important. All right. So I want to give you a very, very simple model for giving feedback. And it is one where if you're giving feedback, positive feedback or course correction feedback, if you're giving feedback in the workplace, you're giving feedback at home, you know, wherever, it works because, again, it's one of those where you're trying to get the feedback that you're giving, first one, to be as specific as you possibly can. You say to somebody, you've been in a meeting and they did a really good job, they were in charge of this meeting, and the meeting worked really well, stayed on track, so forth. And you go to them and say, great job in that meeting, I really appreciate your work. Feels good, but they have absolutely no idea what they should repeat the next time. So if you take it just a little bit further down and say, you did a great job in the meeting, you were really good at being able to keep us on track. When we started going down rat holes, you pulled us out, or you made sure that the right agenda was there and we knew what we needed to do beforehand, whatever it happens to be. Do that next layer of feedback, because the more specific you can be with feedback, the more likely the person is to be able to take that feedback and then incorporate it into their behavior. Okay? So that's number one, is describe the behaviors as specifically as you can describe them. Then say what the impact is. What's the so what? Okay? I did this, but why did it matter? Because sometimes when you think about the first one, somebody will do something and you're saying, I need to give them that feedback. You need to be real clear of, does it really matter? Is it just because it bugged you that you want to give them the feedback? And that can be a legitimate reason why. Or did it have a really big impact on something you were trying to do? And letting people know the impact will help them understand, okay, how seriously do I need to take this feedback? And what do I need to do with it? So again, trying to be specific about what they've done, what the behavior is, what it is that you've seen, and then what the impact of that was. What did it cause? Okay. The third one then is based off of an assumption of people want to do the right thing. Most people don't come into their work environment, any environment, but their work environment and say, you know, I really hope I can screw this up. They want to do the right thing, but don't necessarily know what that right thing is. So one of the things that's important when you're giving feedback is, if you can, describe to them what would successful behavior look like, particularly if you're managing somebody and they're growing and learning. What is it that I didn't see that I wanted to see, and why? So it's like, what was the behavior, what was the impact, and what does success look like. It puts a little bit more burden on you to really think about what was it that didn't go quite right, and what, if they had done it in the right way, what would it have looked like? Okay? So getting a little bit more prescriptive about it. Now, it doesn't mean you're telling people how to do everything, but it's telling them what your expectation was and what it would have looked like had you seen that behavior done in the way that you think it should be. Okay? And then the last one, and this is really important if you're giving somebody course correction feedback, negative feedback. I prefer calling it course correction versus negative, because all of a sudden we get into this whole thing about, well, I don't want to just tell them bad things. But it's to get them to do something differently in a more productive way. But if it is negative feedback, telling people what the consequences are is really, really important. And I know there's a couple of HR people in the room. One of the things that we hear a lot when we get to somebody that's in a problem where they're to the chance of getting fired, and they're surprised. They had no idea they were at that point. And that's because somebody, when they've been giving them feedback, didn't tell them the consequences. They didn't tell them how serious it was. Now, there can be positive consequences and there can be negative consequences. So positive consequences is saying, you know what, if you master this, if you do this in the way successfully, then I can give you more responsibility, or I can have you take on this project or whatever. That's a positive consequence. The negative consequence is, you know what, in order to be able to stay in the job and continue to get credibility in doing what you need to do, you need to do this. If not, your job could be in jeopardy if it goes all the way down the end of that. Okay? So consequences is really, really important in giving feedback. Okay? Before and after. Well, talk about what you mean by before and after. I agree with you, but I want to make sure we're on the same page.
Like, you could talk about a future project someone's working on, but you could also do this as an evaluation of something they've already done.
Yep, absolutely. It could go in both. It can go into absolute both. Yep. Okay? So again, just remember, describe it as specifically as you can. Tell them what the impact, the so what is. Make sure that you can help them understand what successful behavior looks like, and then if there are consequences, make sure they know what those consequences are. Okay? Now, one thing that's also important in here, and this is something that I know I have to remind, I actually have a story on this and remind myself of. 1 minute praise. It does not take a lot of time to give somebody positive feedback. Now, I know one of you said, we're very good at giving positive feedback in our organization. And that's good, because a lot of times what we do is we're moving so fast, we critique versus reinforce. And so, again, taking the time, you can use the same DISC model and giving positive feedback, but it only takes a minute, and the more specific you can be, again, people are likely to repeat the behaviors. Right? So you want it to be as specific as it can, and you want it to be as timely as you can. Okay? My story on this one, this was a hard-learned lesson. I actually had a superstar in my group. She was absolutely amazing, awesome, off the chart. We got into a conversation one day, and she said, I'm really demoralized. And I said, what's going on? And she said, I don't think you think I'm doing very well. I was blown away, because in my mind, she was a superstar, absolute superstar. The problem is because she was a superstar, I never spent any time telling her that. So it was a huge lesson for me, because I thought I had been reinforcing it, and luckily we had a good enough relationship that she told me I wasn't doing what I needed to do. And it was a big lesson, because again, sometimes the squeaky wheels are the ones that we focus on, and we forget the people that are actually the highest performers. Okay. How many of you, because I'm assuming you're all pretty high performers, how many of you have gotten a review, a formal feedback review within the last year? Actually more than I would have thought. Okay. It doesn't count if it's from the board. Actually, that's a joke. That's actually good, because what I have found is as you go up in the organization, you take on more and more responsibility, you get less and less feedback. So what happens is you're going up and you're in probably your highest learning modes, but you're not getting the kind of feedback you got when you first started out. So again, don't let that happen in your organization. Make sure that you're giving feedback across the board so that people up and down the organization understand what they need to do. Okay? All right. So I'm going to talk about performance management in two aspects. I'm going to talk about kind of the what that you need to create, and then some of the hows to pay attention to. So the first thing, and I think this is my belief around performance management and the most important, you need to create a culture of feedback so that in your organization, feedback happens on a regular, consistent kind of basis. So that when somebody gets feedback, they don't freak out because they hadn't heard anything in the last year. So it's one where it happens on a regular basis. And it happens, some of the things that you were talking about here before, it happens in a 360 way. So people that work for you give you feedback, your peers give you feedback, your boss gives you feedback. But it becomes part of your culture. And if you start that early on, your ability to be able to scale that later on is much improved. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned you are mostly focusing on feedback rather than performance reviews.
Right.
And you're talking about 360, which I totally understand in the sense of performance reviews. Are you, are you suggesting that we do 360 in just general feedback? And if so, how would we encourage that in like a non-formalized way? You know what I mean? Like how would I encourage someone who works underneath me to give me this casual feedback?
Okay. Ask them. No, I'm serious. So I think that one is talk about it in your organization. So talk about, this is something that's important to us, is we're only going to get better if we feel comfortable in giving each other feedback and doing it in a way that is productive. So you talk about it. So that's number one, is you talk about it and make it okay. The second is you, as a manager, you ask for it. And you can ask for it in staff meetings. You can ask for it in one-on-ones if you do one-on-ones. You can, I have a number of companies that are doing more pulse surveys. So they actually do pulse surveys by group. Everybody know what a pulse survey is, right? Okay. So they actually go out and they've got a formalized way. And then what they do is they take the feedback that they get from those pulse surveys from their team, and then they go into the team and they talk about it. So that's not individual well, some of it's individual feedback, but it's also team feedback. So I think creating the environment where you're soliciting the feedback is a big part of it. I think the other thing is and this is kind of a course correction piece. Sometimes what happens as a manager is you will get somebody on the team coming to you and say, I'm really having a hard time with John. I'm not getting what I need from him. He's late on the deliverables, whatever it happens to be. And so what you do is you then go try to work the issue with John. Another way to do it to encourage your feedback is to say, what I want you to do is I want you to take that feedback to him. And then if you don't get it resolved and you guys can't come to an agreement, then come to me. But you push it back down in the organization. So that's another way of reinforcing it. So it's subtle ways. It's not formal kind of way. It can be formal ways by using those surveys, but it can also be informal ways in the way in which you lead by example or model the behavior. Okay. The other thing on performance reviews, if you're doing performance reviews, I believe that performance reviews should have input from their critical stakeholders. Now that doesn't mean everybody that's their peers, for example, but it's the people they interact with the most. So you can build into your performance review structure where you gather feedback from those individuals. So, and you and the employee can sit down and say, okay, who are the people that are most critical from your success, and who do you want to get feedback from? And that's where I gather feedback from. So it's not just feedback from their boss to them, but it's feedback. It could be from their team. It could be from their peers. So you can actually build that into your performance review process. Okay. Does that answer your question? Or? Okay. Anybody else have ideas of what they've done to instill this kind of feedback culture? Weekly.
Weekly sit down with one-on-ones.
Right. Yep. And one-on-ones, again, if you structure your one-on-ones, a lot of times they're task reviews and what's going on and problems and so forth. Structure a piece in there that says, let's talk about some feedback. What can I do to better support you? What can you do better to support me? So you build it into those one-on-ones as part of your regular agenda. And again, none of this has to take a lot of time. It will take more time if you don't do it than it will if you get in a regular habit of doing it. Okay? Now, I also believe, and I know that I'm kind of fighting against the stream here, I believe that feedback, course correction feedback. Course correction feedback is best done face-to-face if you can, then voice-to-voice if you can't, and email is your last resort. And the reason being on course correction is once you hit that send button, you all know this, you have no control over where it goes. So, and you also cannot interact to make sure that your intent of what you're trying to get across is clearly understood on the other side. And I know that it's hard to do when you've got everybody working remotely, But again, making sure you've got enough of the different touch points, even if it's always voice to voice. If you can never see the person in person, that's okay. But if it's a voice to voice, you'll get a little bit different interaction. So again, mix it up and make sure that when you're giving feedback, it's not always just an email that goes across. Okay? Because and I know you've seen it. You've seen a lot of them misinterpreted. All right, so building that culture. Utilizing and understanding feedback increases productivity, increases the way we do what we do. That's why we do it. If it doesn't, then we need to figure out what's wrong with our feedback process. But the purpose of doing this is to help each other get better at what we do. Okay? Help each other solve problems as they come up. It also is a way on the feedback to make sure that what the employee is working on and what you're working on are the right things, that it's aligned with where you're trying to take the organization. So again, if you only get together once a quarter, and you guys are in pretty fast-changing businesses, if you get together once a quarter to talk about goals and you don't talk about it the rest of the quarter, I'm guessing that by the time the quarter starts and the quarter ends, the goals are different. Not the top goals, but the execution goals, because things change fast. So you've got to have a way of regularly checking in to say, are we on track? Because you don't want somebody going off and working on stuff that is not the best use of their time. Right? And then the last one is recognizing progress as well as results along the way. So it's keeping people charged up about what they're doing, making sure that you know if they're hitting barriers, and they need to do something different to make progress, but also recognizing the result when they get there. So I think that, again, it's about positive reinforcement, not just course correction. It has both. Right? Now, some of the things about how you do it, this goes back to something somebody had said. Lead by example, to me, is number one. So it's not only giving feedback, but soliciting feedback. It's letting people know that you're open to hear what they have to say. Because the more open you are to hear it, the more willing, most of the time, they will be to listen to what you have to say to them. So, and this goes true on peer basis too. So again, making sure you solicit the feedback from your critical stakeholders. Showing personal appreciation, that was that 1-minute praise. I mean, it's good to say to people, thank you for what you're doing. And again, sometimes we're moving so fast we don't think about that. But that is huge feedback for them. It's a reinforcement that they're on track. Respect the individual, and I'm going to actually put these two, and valuing differences. You need to know the individual you're giving the feedback to, because not everybody can hear it in the same way. There are some people you can take a 2x4, hit them on the head, and that works great. There are other people that you have to kind of ease into the feedback, which is different than sugarcoating. You're still being direct, but you kind of have to ease into it, and you need to have the relationship. Know the individual and know what works best for them. Okay? Not what works best for you, but what works best for them. Okay? And then being direct. You know, you talked about this on this side. The more direct you can be, the more trust you will build from the individual. If they keep getting feedback about themselves that you've given to somebody else, then what happens is the trust is eroded. So being direct with the person you want to give the feedback to, okay, is really important. Keeping it timely and constructive. You know, don't be mean. So, you know, you can give very hard feedback in a very constructive way. Also giving it close to the time whenever something has happened, positive, okay, positive or negative. The better you can associate with the time, the more impact you're going to wind up having. And then focus on behavior, not on intent. You know, sometimes we will assume intent behind a behavior. Somebody will do something and it's like, well, there they go again. They did that because it's going to make them look good versus the team look good. Or they did that because they don't believe in what we're trying to do here and they want to go in a different way. I mean, whatever it happens to be, that's intent, not behavior. And what you will find is a large number of times you're wrong about the intent. And when you confront someone, when you're direct with them and giving them feedback and you're implying the intent, you're going to get into a discussion of that's not what I intended to do at all. And you get into this loop. Versus saying, okay, here's the behavior I saw. Here's what I saw happen. I'm going to suspend belief as to why it happened, but here's what happened. Here's the impact of it. Okay? Here's what I think should have happened. Here's what success looks like. If you stay at that level and not try to get into intent, again, you'll have a much more productive conversation. Okay? Is that clear? Questions on that?
So this, I guess, kind of runs counter to the idea of being really explicit and direct, specific, but especially as it pertains to giving like negative feedback or using like something that went wrong as an opportunity to teach or train or mentor someone. What are your thoughts on using more of a directed exploratory approach where like something happened, and when you're talking to that person, you ask them, so how did you feel that, you know, this thing went from your perspective, and let them provide some feedback, and then like in the back of my mind I have a sense of where I want to go, what we want to talk about, and so I can kind of ask questions and allow them to almost, well, you know, 9 times out of 10 they will provide feedback that I would want to anyways, but it kind of turns it from you know, you did this wrong, here's what I expected to happen, and this is, you know, the impact it had, and it allows them to kind of, you know, acknowledge, yeah, this didn't work well. I can hear some of their feedback in terms of why they think that might be, but also kind of direct the conversation.
I think that can work very well with a caveat, as long as it doesn't feel like a setup. So if you go in and say, look, I'm not sure this went the way it needs to, but I'm not totally sure I understand why. So let's talk about it from your perspective. What do you think? That doesn't feel like a setup. What does feel like a setup is, okay, how did you think this went? And they say, I think it went absolutely wonderful. And now you're sitting here saying, okay, now how am I going to get it back? So again, go in with honest intent and saying, I want to explore some. I want to explore, just like you said, I think exploration is a great way, and it's self-learning. It's someone kind of doing the analysis themselves, which means then that they have to trust your intent, which is to help get them better. So yeah, I think that can be a very effective way, again, as long as you deal with the caveat of they don't feel like they've been set up. Yeah. That's why I also believe when you get into performance reviews, I think self-evaluations can be very useful if what the person isn't doing is trying to, if they're not self-aware, you get into a problem. Because then what happens if they're not self-aware and you don't believe they're performing, you've got yours over here and theirs over here, and there's a huge gap between them. So you have to kind of understand where the person's coming from, and did they get enough feedback that they can honestly evaluate themselves. Like in this case, do they have enough to know what actually went well, what didn't go well? Then it can be used effectively that way. Yeah. Question?
Are there situations where it's effective to use kind of the praise sandwich technique where, or it could work against being direct in some cases, I guess?
Yes and yes. So if you're trying to give this thing where it talked about balanced on here, if you're trying to give somebody balanced feedback, if there's some things they did really well and there's some things that didn't go as well, it's okay, in my opinion, it's okay to say, okay, here are the things that went really well. Here are some of the things that didn't, but I want to reinforce. There was some stuff that went well. So that's the sandwich thing. And I think that's okay. When it's not okay is when they miss the middle message and all they hear is the two ends. So what you've done is you've soft pedaled the middle so much that they didn't hear it, because that's not fair. Because now what they're walking away with is a very different impression than what your intent was. So if you're going to use the sandwich thing, again, make sure that the middle message, if it's a course correction, the middle message is clear. And you can have them come back to say, okay, play back to me. I want to make sure we're on the same wavelength. Tell me what you heard me say as far as what went really well. What are some of the things we need to do differently? So you can validate it. Okay. And sugarcoating is different than that one. Sugarcoating is, I'm going to make this message so obtruse that if you're really sharp, you can find the little nugget in there. Don't do that, people. You know, it's not fair. So, you know, that's different. The sandwich is different than sugarcoating to me.
So, question about sugarcoating, you know, knowing the individual. What if you do have an individual who's more sensitive, but you don't want to sugarcoat, but you want to ease in? Can you know, any tips or talk about that a little bit?
Couple of techniques. One is do it in phases. So it's not one conversation, it's multiple conversations. So you say, you know, what I want to do is talk about, because there's some issues here I want to talk about. Let me kind of lay it out. Then I want you to go away, think about it, and then let's come back and talk about what we're going to do next. So I think that phasing it, because you give the individual time to kind of go away and do their emotion. The other thing, how many of you have ever heard of the concept active listening? Okay. So for those of you who hadn't, I'll do a quick one. And you've had it done to you, I'll almost guarantee. So active listening is where there's 3 pieces to it. The first is to acknowledge what you heard the other person say. So here's what I heard you say. Let me make sure I understand. Here's what I heard you say. Tell me a little bit more about it. That's the explore part. And then you can respond. Okay? Now, when it's very, very useful when you're in an emotional situation with somebody, you know, if you've got the tears or you've got the anger or whatever, what you can come back and say, look, here's what I'm hearing you say and what I think you're feeling. Okay, tell me more about where that's coming from, and then let's talk about what we do about it. So acknowledging their emotions sometimes will get them to the next step of being able to explore. So that's another technique. The other one is little things like if you know that it's a highly emotional person and this is going to be an emotional topic, do it somewhere that's private. You know, don't do it in an open cube. Don't do it in a glass cube and with them facing out. I mean, little things like that. Go for a walk. Walks are amazing neutralizers. There's something, and I don't know what it is, but there is something, there's a psychological thing that talks about this. When you're walking beside somebody and you're both facing in a different direction, the ability to deliver very hard messages is much, much easier. When you're looking at somebody, it's much more difficult. So if you've got a really emotional situation, go for a walk, you know, and try to have the conversation that way. I used it with my son because when you're driving in a car, the same thing happens. And especially if they're in the back seat, you can have these conversations. It's like you're on different planets for some reason. But it just takes the emotion out. And again, I don't totally understand why, but I know it does. So that would be another tip. Mm-hmm.
Talk about giving feedback to your manager versus somebody who you're managing. Are there any nuances there, or is it the same rules apply?
Most of the same rules apply, but you also have to judge their willingness to hear the messages. So if you have someone that is open, that likes to interact with you in that way, that you have a trust relationship with, then this whole thing about make sure you're direct, you know, make sure it's timely, constructive, all of those apply. If it is someone that is not as open to feedback, then you've got to find some ways to get in so that they understand your intent. And so it can be phasing it. You know, I want to talk about these things. Here's the agenda. I'd like to schedule some time so they have a chance to think through it. It can be part, if you do reviews, it can be part of the review process would be one way of opening it up. What I would recommend to anybody that's taking on a new team or if you have a new boss is to sit down and actually talk to the person before you ever get into any situation that you need to give feedback of saying, tell me how you best receive feedback. What works for you? So that it's not in the emotional moment, and then when you get in the emotional moment, if it happens to be that, you can come back and say, okay, you told me this is the best way to give you feedback, so what I want to do is give you some feedback in this way. So try to set the parameters up front and kind of the methodology that will work for them up front. But I think the same thing. Again, I think you got to be direct, you got to be timely, you got to be constructive, you got to focus on the behavior, not on the intent. You need to describe as much as you can what the feedback is and what the impact to you was. I think all of those things still hold true. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I understand the importance of managing the way different people would receive feedback, but it's tough for me because I run the risk of actually treating people differently or having different expectations. So is there a way like for me to think about it in like a rational way? Like I'm afraid that if I'll treat one person differently, just purely from the way I approach the discussion, like in the back of my head, I'll actually be viewing them differently in terms of skill or in terms of like responsibility I give them just because of that. So it's like a subconscious sort of thing. So I run that risk by actually treating people different, or by actually communicating to them differently. I might actually start treating them differently.
Well, my initial response is you should treat people differently because people need different things at different times. Well, that's the key right there. different and fair are two different things. You can be fair and treat somebody differently. Okay? So I think that's the filter that you've got to go through of saying a couple of things. Am I treating them differently because this is the way that will help them the most? Or am I treating them differently because I have a different set of expectations? And again, we have different expectations of people when they're in different learning curves, for example, or different skill sets. But being real clear about your own intent, why are you doing what you're doing? I think the key is you need to value that people are different. And so the way you receive feedback is different. The way you learn is different. I am an auditory learner. I mean, you could give me a book and I can read it and I won't be able to tell you what I read after I finish reading it. Okay, it doesn't work for me. There are some people that have to visually see it. Some people have to learn by experiencing it. So there are different learning styles that people have. So I think it's understanding the differences with the intent of trying to tailor what you're doing to work best for them. Not to be unfair, not to treat them discriminatorily, from one to the other, but to do it in a way that works best for them. Does that answer it?
It makes it kind of abstract, but I think when you actually have to do it, it's pretty tough.
You have to pay very close attention to what's going on inside you and how you're operating. There's a program, it's been around forever, it's called Situational Leadership. And it is probably one of the best training. My tolerance level is about this long in training, so my thing is I can't do it for long periods of time. But this is one I actually sat through and I learned a lot on it because it talks about and you'll see this in a second when I get into difficult conversations, it talks about understanding a person's motivation and their ability. And then you manage to whatever that happens to be. So if they have low ability, not a lot of experience, but they're highly motivated, then you're probably going to be more in a tell style of management because they need more instruction. Whereas if they have the ability but they're not motivated to do it, then you've got to be kind of the cheerleader. It's a great way of thinking about how you manage differences, okay, in a productive kind of way. So that would be one that I'd take a look at. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this last one, foster creativity. Sometimes we forget the fact that when we are in situations where things aren't going quite the way they need to go, that is usually when the highest creativity comes in because you have to reset the way you're looking at the world. And so feedback can help you foster creativity. It can help generate ideas up through the organization, across the organization, down from the organization. It can create the ideas. It can create an environment where people are not only comfortable giving each other feedback, but giving each other ideas. And so a feedback culture, what you find is cultures that are really good at giving feedback and open dialogue are also highly creative because that's part of the creative process. So again, keep in mind that feedback is not just praise, it's not just course correction, but it also can be innovation, okay, and new ideas. All right? Oops, and I'm going the wrong way, sorry. All right. I mentioned before there's a lot of tools that can support a feedback culture. And these are just some of the ones that I see out there. You can do customized surveys, about the individuals, but you can also do it about the organization. So it's a way to check in with the organization on an ongoing basis. Scorecards. There's several companies that actually create a scorecard around here are some of the expectations of how we want people to operate, collaboration, innovation, some of those kinds of things. And we actually score each other and the organization on a regular basis, usually on a quarterly basis, to see how we're doing. Are you familiar with Glint? I'm not promoting Glint, but Glint is a survey tool that actually is looking at values of an organization and how those values translate into performance. But again, it's a survey type of tool. And then I went online to look, because what I had to do is make sure that True Ventures wasn't investing in one of the companies that I was, or the competitor of what I was actually getting ready to put up here. But I Googled the 360. 74 tools came up for 360 feedback. I had no idea they were out there. But there's lots and lots of tools. I think the important part is you can find a tool that will help facilitate that feedback culture when you create it. But focus on why you're doing it and what the content is, not the tool. because oftentimes we'll wind up overlaying somebody else's tool on top of us, and they're not really the competencies that are important to us or the values that are important to us in our organization. So you're at a stage in your company development, it should be highly customized. It should be exactly what you're trying to drive in the organization, whether it be organizational behaviors or individual behaviors. Okay? But there's lots of tools to facilitate it. All right? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about difficult conversations, because this is the thing that I hear from managers the most is, I hate doing this. You know, when somebody gets off track, I hate this process. How many of you have actually had to do a tough conversation that actually ended in termination? Okay. Would you agree with the statement that it's hard or not? Not so much?
The thing is that it depends. If you feel that you've been going through a decent process with the person beforehand, and they understand very clearly, not like the day before, but many weeks before, that what they're doing is going to get them fired, then this is just, look, if you drive the car into the tree, it'll fall on you. You smash the car. Hey, that's what you did. So that's what's happening here. Yeah.
Thank you, because you just talked about what my next 4 slides are.
Okay.
What makes it difficult is when we don't prepare and we don't have a process and it surprises somebody. What makes it easier, it's never easy because it's affecting someone's life, but what makes it easier is if we have in fact worked the person through and tried to get them to the point where they needed to get to. So I think that the key here then is, how do you prepare the individual and how do you prepare yourself for having these conversations? So when you get to a point where it's not going where you want it to go, okay, critical part of feedback is to deliver that feedback to the person and help them course correct. 4 questions that you need to ask. And this you do before you ever go into the conversation with the employee. Number 1 is, were the expectations clear? Did I tell the person what I expected? Not only the what, but the how. Okay? And that's one where you have to do some self-reflection here. And hopefully, if you answer that first question no, then you have time to go back to say, okay, let's reset the expectations here and make sure you understand what I'm expecting you to do. Okay? But expectations clear, what and how. Right? Second one is, do they have what they need to accomplish the task? So, you know, and this could be information, this could be tools, this could be resources, this could be skill sets that they've got. So understanding, are they set up to succeed as much as you can? Okay? You're not always going to have everything, but enough to be able to accomplish this. Third one then, and this is the tricky one, is, can the performance be corrected? Now, again, I know I'm going to go against some of the HR norms here, but I do not believe in creating these processes that are fake processes just to get through the legal hurdles, right? Because I think it does more damage to the relationship for the employee, but also for the other people that are observing it. So my thing, that doesn't mean that you don't do things in the right way, but what it means is that you're honest with the employee and honest with yourself of, does this person really have a chance of succeeding? If they do, then you do everything you can to try to get them to that point. If they don't, then you have an honest conversation with them as to why you don't think they can get there. And sometimes it's things like the skills they need today, it's going to take them a year to get, and they've got to get up to speed within a month. So sometimes it's a timing thing. Sometimes it's an interest thing on their part. What you need for them to do now is different than even when you hired them. And that happens, in startups, that happens all the time. The organization goes either in a different direction or scales faster than some of these individuals can actually scale. And it's having that honest conversation, not just when you're ready to take an action, but up until that point in time, preparing them for that. But being very honest with yourself and with the employee of, can it be corrected, so you don't set them up to fail. Okay? And then the last one is, what can you do to help? Doesn't mean you own it. They own their performance. But what can you do to help? So you have a role and responsibility in this, and you need to be engaged with the employee on it. Okay? Now, the process that I think, and this is kind of the guide for the conversation, it starts with expectations. Okay? What was it supposed to look like? The what and the how. What were you supposed to do? How are you supposed to do it? What's the gap? And you go back to the DISC model. Specifically describe what the gap is. Help them understand what success would have looked like, okay, had they been able to do it on that. Don't make excuses and don't over-criticize. Okay, I know you couldn't do this because you didn't have enough time, you didn't have enough resources, whatever. It is what it is, okay? So stay with what you're actually seeing in the behaviors, but also don't over-criticize and says, you know what, you always miss deadlines. Well, they probably don't always miss deadlines. They may miss them more than you want. But so again, stick as specifically as you can with the behavior and the expectation and where the gaps are between those, all right? And then stop talking and start listening. So this goes back to the exploration thing that you mentioned before. Here's where you explore with the employee about, do they know what they need to do? Are the expectations clear? Do they have the ability to do it? Do they have the motivation to do it? Okay? You need to assess that by having the conversation with them and engaging with them. So it's not just a one-way street of you delivering the feedback. It's you also getting feedback and problem solving with the person to see if you can get it where it needs to go. Right? Then what kind of support can you give? You know, again, don't overpromise and underdeliver. So if you say, well, the person says, well, what I need to do is I need to meet with you on a daily basis to make sure we're on track. And you know you're not going to be able to meet with them on a daily basis. Don't commit to it. You know, say to them, I can't do it on a daily basis. I can do it every 3 days, or I can do it once a week. So let's figure out how to make that work. So if you're going to commit to something, make sure you can do it and then follow through, because you own part of this as well. And then I talked about consequences. Make sure they understand what the consequences are. Where are we in the process? Are we in the beginning of it where I'm just telling you that there's a gap now and you need to fix it? And you know what, the consequences may just be, look, I may have to redesign or take something off your plate or whatever. Or are we at the point where, you know what, we've been talking about this for a while, you're on a critical path. If we don't fix this, your job's in jeopardy. So where are you on that consequence end? So make sure that they aren't surprised when you hit the point where it's not working and you're now having another conversation. Okay? And then set up a regular follow-up process. So again, it's not you deliver feedback and then you walk away and then you come back at the next month or the next quarter, whatever. You need to support them along the way. And you need to understand you've now created a lot of anxiety with this person. And so you need to make sure that you're there for them. Okay? Let me stop for a second. Questions on that? Anything that you want clarification on?
Okay, so I'm an HR person and I believe in all of this too. So I just want to distinguish when, and it may be next, you go into like a performance improvement plan. Is that it? I don't believe in those, I'm with you.
Right.
And so this is still the conversation, right?
Yes.
I just want to clarify that.
This is the conversation.
Okay.
And yeah, we'll talk about the performance improvement plans, because I don't know, and I'm maybe preaching to the choir, and you may all know this. You are not legally mandated to provide anybody with a performance improvement plan. Everybody know that? You're in an at-will state. If your company policy is at-will, and your company policy does not say you do a progressive discipline, then you don't have to do one. Right? So you're not mandated by law. So this is about what's the right thing to do, not what the legal thing to do. All right, so I want to make a distinction on there. So in this conversation, this could be a corrective action process conversation. It could be the first conversation, okay, and you get to a point where, I'm not supposed to go out of the light, you get over to consequences, and it's like, you know what, if you don't correct it, then we're probably going to have a more serious conversation. So that's your first conversation. It could be a second conversation or a third conversation that says, you know what, we've talked about this before, it hasn't gotten any better, it has to change, or we're going to have to take you out of this role, whether we take you out of the company or take you out of the role, whatever. So it could be at that point too. So that could be more of a corrective action or a performance plan conversation. Okay? Yes?
Should you document the conversations?
Yes. I believe you should. And I would document in a very specific kind of way. Your first conversation, well, actually, no, it would be the same in all of them. I like having the employee, after I've had one of these conversations, send back to me in an email that says, here's what I heard. Because then you know whether or not you got the points across that you need to have. And there's some ownership that they then have because they've now played back to you. I think that is the ideal documentation. At a minimum, you should jot down, have the conversation about this with the employee at this point in time. So if you ever get to a point where you have to defend legally what you've done, you have a history of what your conversations have been. But I think if you can get the ownership on the employee's part to make sure that the understanding is there, it's more positive for them, more positive for you. Is that okay? Yeah, she's my test to make sure that I'm doing it in the right kind of way. So you may get to, hopefully you have these conversations, everything turns around, you get people back on track and you're sailing away. But if not, then there is a conversation about parting ways. And my thing is it starts out with, it isn't working and it's time to move on. And actually it starts out before that. It says, as we've been talking about over X period of time, here are the issues, it hasn't gotten better, it's now time to move on. But it's a very direct conversation. Again, not mean, but direct. It's respectful, it has dignity to it, but it's one where you are very direct and you don't go into this conversation and you start with all the chit chat and then you kind of go, well, yeah, here's kind of what's going on, and then you lower the boom on them. So again, direct, to the point, kind, and with dignity, all right, but to the point. You need to follow your company's process. Now, a lot of you may be in situations of writing your company process. So be very clear about what that process is, because once you've written it down and communicated it to people, you have to follow it. Right? Now, I believe from a policy standpoint, and again, I'm kind of off to the side from HR people, I don't believe in big policy manuals early on, because I don't think you know yet what you want to be or do. But there's a few policies you probably need to write, and one of them may be how you give people feedback and or how you deal when it's not going well. But again, flexibility is the key on that, so you can deal with individual situations. But if you have a company policy, you have to follow it, right? Or change it. But change it before you have to follow it. Okay. I'm going to wrap up, and I know we've got just a few minutes, and I didn't do what I said I was going to do, which is allow the time for questions. So here are the things that, and we've talked about most of these, the one I want to point out is it is your job to give feedback, right? Not just with people that work for you, but it's also your peers, and if you have a boss, I think it's to your boss. So it's your responsibility to give feedback, because that's how everybody gets better. Focus on the behavior, not on the intent. Try to be as specific as you possibly can. And again, don't ever, when you get to a point where it's not working, don't ever let it be a surprise to the person that you've gotten there, particularly when it gets far enough down the road that their job is in jeopardy, because that is the hardest situation to manage, when they had no idea it was coming. All right. Then takeaways on here is, again, I'm not going to go through those, you can see them. Create that culture. Feedback comes from a lot of different places. So again, internally and externally. So make sure you're creating an environment that welcomes that, solicits that, and takes that in so that you can get better. And then again, focus on the behaviors and not the story. This actually comes from, are you familiar with a book called Crucial Conversations? It's another one of those. I'm not, as I said before, I'm not a big reader. This is a really good book, most of it. So it takes a little bit to get through some of it. But there's a thing in there that says what we do as human beings is we will see something, a behavior, and then what we do is we put our story around it. And the story is about their intent. You know, I talked about before. Here's the intent. Here's what they were trying to do. Here's how it affected me. All of the stuff around it. And then we react emotionally to the story versus to the behavior. So if you can try to stop yourself from doing that and say, okay, what's the behavior here? What is it that they're actually doing that is not productive? Okay? And focus there, and that's how you give your feedback. Okay. Thank you very much. But questions, and I've got as much time as you've got. So I know we're supposed to end, I think, at 1:45. But questions, anything else that has spurred in your thoughts? You're all set? Okay. Thank you very much. And again, I put some of the hard copy, if you wanted, of some of, not all the slides, but some of the slides in there. And I've also got some cards. If you have questions, you get into a situation, it's like, you know what, I just need somebody to bounce this off of. It's free. Call me. And I will be happy to help you through some of it. Okay? Thank you.